Britain's jails are overflowing. More than 86,000 prisoners are currently incarcerated within their walls. For almost all of these prisoners, the aim is rehabilitation and release. But a tiny number are deemed so dangerous and depraved that they will never be freed. This extraordinary group of 47 men and 1 woman includes serial killers, torturers, hired assassins, and psychotic sadists. In some cases, the faces are familiar. Others are better known by the nicknames given to them by the press. But many of them you will never have heard of. This series will shine a light on the dark world of some of these killers. The subject of this film is a man who sparked a nationwide manhunt. A diagnosed psychopath.
He did say society and professionals think I'm mad, but I'm not.
Who repaid people's kindness with violence.
Punched her in the face, blacked her eyes, knocked her teeth out, and this is a woman of 78.
And had a burning hatred of religion.
He pinned a note to their kitchen table with a knife. He basically threatened Christian scum.
Stephen Farrow was a man on a mission.
She'd been beaten to death with a walking stick and sustained a fatal stab wound to her neck.
Who would stop at nothing to exact a chilling revenge on the church.
When I found out that he had actually murdered the Reverend, golly, he said he was going to do that, and he did.
This is Thornbury, a quiet market town in Gloucestershire, in the southwest of England. There has been a town here for more than 750 years, built around St Mary's Church, its oldest building. But it was here, in February 2012, that the whole town received an almighty shock.
Well, my news editor got the call, just one of our contacts saying that there was a lot of police outside the church. So he sent the photographer down just to check it out. And then I got a call saying, yes, there really is something happening down there. They've cordoned off the street. You have to go right now. So I went down.
Marion Sauverbois is a reporter on the local newspaper, the Thornbury Gazette.
There was just a police officer just standing there telling us that we couldn't go into the church, wouldn't tell us anything, and there were just police vans outside the vicarage. And just cordoning off the whole street, not letting people through, that's unusual. I mean, it can be a small accident. You know something bad's happened, but you don't know who was involved.
Word soon spread that a body had been discovered.
Nothing happened till a church warden started walking towards cordon and let him through. So as I saw him sort of going towards the church, I asked him why they were letting him through, if he knew anything. And that was kind of a bit of a shock to me. He said, it's the vicar, how could he have done this to himself? And he looked really upset, and he was there with his wife, and his wife was about to burst into tears when he said that. And so we thought, right, so did the vicar kill himself?
The local vicar was Reverend John Suddards. He had recently moved to the parish of Thornbury, looking for one last challenge in his career. Now he'd been found dead, and rumours suggested it was suicide.
No one really knew the vicar. He'd been a vicar at St Mary's for 6 months and a half. He was always out, he was always doing something. He was really, really trying to get involved in the community, but he didn't really share much about his personal life.
The shock of the vicar's death would soon turn to disbelief. Police revealed that Reverend Suddards hadn't committed suicide at all. Reverend Suddards had been brutally stabbed to death.
He was surrounded by lots and lots of random objects, but apparently placed. There were some homosexual pornography, some condoms, some party poppers. There was a Bible open on his chest.
Bizarrely, a half-eaten apple was placed between the victim's legs, and pornographic DVDs and photos were strewn around the scene.
It would have taken a long time. It's not just someone who was there, carried out the deed and then left. To some extent, move the body around as well, to place certain objects on it, around it, to make it look a certain way. So, I don't know how long it would have taken, but it certainly wouldn't have been 2 minutes and then he was out the door. It would have taken a lot of preparation.
Kerry Danes is a forensic psychologist. She studies killers and what motivates them to commit their crimes.
The scene that's created in Thornbury is like something out of an American crime drama. It's probably been very thrilling for them to imagine the shock and the horror on the parts of the person who's come across this crime scene, who's had cause to look at it. But what's really central is that they want to humiliate the vicar.
It was just a massive shock. Murder in Thornbury was inconceivable, I think. Who attacks a vicar? You think if they attack a vicar, then they could attack anyone.
Weeks earlier, during a radio interview, Reverend Suddards had warned of the potential dangers of always keeping the church open to any visitor.
Christianity is always about risks, or it should be, and we do have to take risks. But we believe that they're the risks that we're called upon to take.
Now, police were questioning whether Suddards' fears had proved prophetic, and an unwelcome guest to the vicarage had committed the most brutal of murders.
They said that someone had been spotted outside the church. So basically they knew that there had been someone there that night, and that's who they wanted to catch, and it was a man.
There was little else for police to go on, as forensic teams scoured the murder scene for clues. But 4 days later, there was a dramatic breakthrough. Detectives now had a name and a face.
Officers say 47-year-old Stephen Farrow, who's known to travel all over Britain, is a danger to the public.
We know that he would seek shelter in a tent that he has with him, or he may purchase. Crucially, he may also seek to exploit the charity of the church community.
And I think this moment of panic where you think, well, is he going to strike again? It's just major confusion. The diocese in the area then tell some priests, be careful, look out for yourself, maybe they're after members of the clergy.
Stephen Farrow was a man on the run, suspected of murder. Police were desperate to find him before he could strike again. But not everything was as it seemed. Stephen Farrow wasn't just guilty of one savage murder, but two. And for more than 30 years, he'd harboured a hatred of the church and its followers.
Stephen Farrow chooses to set fire to a church.
And he knew then that he was going to kill the vicar. In fact, he said he wanted to crucify him.
In 2012, police across Britain were on the hunt for Stephen Farrow, suspected of a violent murder. But his life of crime had begun much earlier, as local journalists found when they began digging into his past.
He would basically take pleasure in hurting pets, his neighbours' pets and animals, and he had fantasies about raping little girls. He had a history of, wanting to and hurting other human beings and animals.
Farrow was one of 6 children and was particularly close to his mother. She later said she thought something was very wrong with Stephen, even as a boy. By the age of 10, he was breaking the law, setting fire to the altar of his local church, and reportedly sitting down outside to watch it burn.
Stephen Farrow was highly dysfunctional even at an early age. We know that he used to hurt animals. Now, this is a major red flag for future violence. As for setting fire to a church, we know that arson tends to peak in young people between the ages of 10 and 25, and often they'll choose a school. So the implication seems quite clear. They set fire to places that have negative connotations for them. Stephen Farrow chooses to set fire to a church. So it's obvious that the church is a place that has very negative associations.
Farrow was sent to a special school for boys who couldn't conform, but it didn't work. And as he reached adulthood, he was getting into more trouble.
He didn't really seem to have any sort of support, and I think that led to maybe more offending later on. And he seemed to be sort of moving from place to place. He seemed to be on his own from an early age anyway.
His first court appearance came in 1979, aged just 16, for burglary. Jail terms followed for theft and deception as Farrow's criminal record grew. In his brief times of freedom, Stephen Farrow would travel the country on road or by foot, and he was known to stay at an informal guest house in Stourbridge belonging to Stella Crow.
Mum used to do bed and breakfast. We usually had somebody in residence because it's quite a large house.
Stella's son Alistair remembers his mum fondly.
She was very well thought of, had many friends, just very clever, very intelligent, independent, strong. They don't make them like that now.
Stella treated every resident as part of the family.
She would have given him the kindness and consideration that she gave everybody. He would have been made very welcome.
But Farrow couldn't keep himself on the straight and narrow. He went to Liverpool in 1993 and was soon jailed for burglary, theft and deception. Just 12 months into his sentence, in August 1994, Farrow was allowed out on a home visit. But with no home to go to, he travelled back to Stourbridge to see Stella.
She had a knock on the door and opened the door, and it turned out to be Stephen Farrow, and he forced entry and subsequently pulled a knife on her. She obviously said, "Listen, you know, if you don't get out, I'll set the dogs on you." And he said, "Well, if you do that, I'll kill them." He said, "I've killed before." He grabbed a petticoat or something out of the laundry basket and tried to tie her up. He tried to gag her with it. He ended up scuffling with her. He's got a knife, and my mother made a grab for the knife, and that cut the fingers quite badly. And then he set about beating her. Punched her in the face, blacked her eyes, knocked her teeth out. And this is a woman of 78.
Farrow had launched an unprovoked attack on an elderly woman and then resorted to robbing her.
He went through her cupboards in the kitchen, or the breakfast room as we used to call it. He must have known that there was money there, because she used to have a little Gale's honey jar with odd change in, you know, and just a bit of float, and took that with him and left my mother like that.
This incident is extremely shocking in its brutality, and it's incredibly cowardly. I think that she's been targeted because she is very frail, she's elderly, and therefore she's an easy recipient of his anger.
Stella Crow was left traumatised, and the psychological effects of the attack left her a different woman.
I didn't realise quite how deeply she'd been affected by this, and she describes herself as being more timid, unable to sleep, you know, and I think she suffered really badly after that attack. I don't think she ever got over that.
Stephen Farrow was tracked down, but he wouldn't go quietly, biting the police officer that made the arrest. In court, he admitted another 29 additional offences of burglary and theft, and the judge jailed him for 8 years. The court heard that Farrow was assessed as a psychopath, scoring 31 out of 40 on a test to measure his mental state.
The easiest way for me to describe a psychopath is somebody whose brain is wired differently, and they simply don't have the capacity to experience a range and depth of emotions like the rest of us do. Now, it's important to point out that psychopaths are not mentally ill as such, and they know what's right from wrong. They simply don't feel it, and so they don't care.
The revelation of Farrow's personality disorder did little to ease Alistair Crow's anger.
The man knew he'd got a dark side, knew he was capable of violence, and wasn't receiving any sort of help in that direction. Why was he released from prison, knowing that he's such a dangerous man?
Months after his sentencing, Stephen Farrow wrote a letter in his cell and sent it to his unfortunate victim.
Mrs. Crow, I could only have written this letter after my court case was over. I am still very distressed to what I have done, and my remorse, which has been with me since that day, is a sentence tenfold to what any judge would have given. There are no excuses to what I put you through. If someone had done to my mother what I had done to you, I myself would be uncontrollably angry. I am ashamed to be my mother's son. And that's signed Stephen Farrow.
I'm sure that Farrow was remorseful at the time that he wrote the letter. It's not that psychopaths don't have any emotions at all. They have what psychologists call proto-emotions. So these tend to be very short-lived, very shallow, rapidly changing. He writes that the guilt will suppress his existence into oblivion. That's quite an idiosyncratic way of expressing yourself.
Well, I've never read a letter like that before. One can't help thinking that maybe this is trying to make him look a bit better than he is.
Whether it was genuine remorse or an attempt to gain parole, only Farrow can know. But although he was behind bars, this violent psychopath was not deemed dangerous enough to stay there permanently. At the end of his sentence in 2001, he was released back into the community, and with no family home to go to, he once again took to travelling the country. Little is known about his movements until he arrived in the Dorset town of Bridport in 2011.
I used to go to the little church in the garden, taking food parcels to the homeless and just basically sitting and chatting to them. See what their situations were, how they were coping with life out on the streets and everything. Here's a blanket or here's a packet of food, anything like that.
It was in spring 2011 that Michaela Rousel spotted someone new during her usual visit to the church.
I recall walking up the path and I instantly thought, oh, a new guy. He enlightened me on the fact that he was a homeless guy, had ended up here in Dorset. And I introduced myself to him as Michaela, and he introduced himself as Stephen Farrow. And that was our first initial meeting. Quite a tall man, well built, sort of walked with a bit of a stoop, but it was the eyes, quite menacing. I just thought there was something eerie about him.
Despite her reservations, Michaela got to know the new arrival.
I remember him telling me that his family just didn't really have anything to do with him. His childhood was quite unsettled, quite sometimes disturbing from what he said. I think he really needed someone to talk to. Just really someone to talk to and to understand him.
Meanwhile, Farrow was enjoying the company of his new acquaintance.
He'd actually told a couple of friends that he quite fancied me. He actually told me on a few occasions. He used to say things like, oh, I'd love to be with you. You're the type of girl I'd like to marry.
Farrow wasn't picky about which church to attend, provided there was something to gain. He visited the Christian Fellowship for the Wednesday service that included a free lunch, and he was a frequent visitor to St Mary's Church in the town, where he asked the local vicar for food and money. But it was the chapel in the garden where he made the biggest impression.
I first met Stephen Farrow at a service here. He was sitting in the pew over there, and he had his cap on, his baseball cap, He looked clean and tidy. I didn't realise he was a homeless person. He had a slightly red face, which presumably is because he'd been in the sunshine, you know, in retrospect, and he had staring eyes. I was quite... he had piercing, staring eyes. Quite unusual.
Philip Colfax is the secretary for the Unitarian Church in Bridport.
He struck me as being very interested in our work here. He'd had an unhappy experience in another chapel nearby, where he felt that they were being condescending and looking down on him, and he liked it here, where where we treated him as an equal, as an ordinary person. I thought he was absolutely target material for the sorts of things that churches ought to be dealing with, which is mental health and emotional health.
But Farrow didn't accept there was anything wrong.
He did say, oh, society and professionals think I'm mad, but I'm not, and that I should be on medication, but I don't need it.
Farrow was given a role at the church to look after the homeless people and act as a caretaker. But not everyone was glad to have him around.
He frightened off some of the congregation, which was a great pity. Some of the people here were quite sensitive to his demeanour and didn't like him at all.
When the congregation took part in a photo project, Farrow revealed some clues as to his feelings about himself.
He put, "I am nothing," and then in quite small writing, and then at the bottom he put, "Yet I am everything." And I was quite upset when I saw that. And he said, yes, but the key is at the bottom where it says, "And yet I am everything."
I am everything. Yes, well, he's grandiose, isn't he? We know that. He is everything in his world because other people are nothing but objects to him. But he's aware that other people view him as nothing. And that's clearly a source of some frustration for him.
Farrow was soon on his feet and managed to get himself a flat on nearby Racks Lane.
I think he felt confined, contained in there. He was quite pleased with the place, but I will say he never got himself a bed, used to sleep on the floor. And I just really do not think he wanted to be inside. He spent several nights still outside, even though he had that flat. Kept himself to himself quite a lot of the time. And sometimes he would be in quite a dark mood and would just tell you to vacate the premises. He didn't want you there.
And one day, his temper boiled over.
There was one occasion where Stephen Farrow made a scene over a roast dinner that I took down and almost complained, boyish-like, that his portion was smaller than the other guys. I thought that was a bit strange and told him to grow up. You know, no need, you've got a meal. Be grateful. And then a fracas erupted, whereas he attacked one of the other homeless guys, my friend John, and pushed him down onto the floor. And so we promptly left. We left the flat and didn't return.
Farrow was attacking the people showing him kindness and turning against the church communities who had welcomed him. And his dangerous behaviour would soon come to the surface.
Then he handed me over this knife and said, "Look, can you take this, as I don't trust myself with this?" I was like, wow. I really didn't feel safe then.
In 2011, dangerous psychopath Stephen Farrow was roaming the country and getting into trouble. His next stop was Devon and the town of Linton. Farrow set up home in a shed surrounded by goats in the Valley of Rocks. Once again, he was drawn to the local churches and made friends.
A friend came into the bar. He said, "I've met this gentleman called Stephen Farrow. He's got nowhere to stay. He hasn't got any food or money. Would we be prepared to give him a meal?" After 2 or 3 days, I said to Stephen he'd be welcome to stay, and well, he jumped at the chance to get out of the cold, and he moved in then.
Christian hotelier Ross Ford had taken pity on Farrow, and he kept a keen eye on his new complimentary guest.
Well, when we went into his room, we discovered he'd dismantled his bed and was sleeping on the floor with a quilt over him. which seemed quite strange, but I got on quite well with him, and I said, well, it'd be good if he could stay for Christmas and have a family Christmas with ourselves. And he did genuinely seem to be looking forward to having a family Christmas here.
Ross was treating Farrow as one of his own, but their friendship lasted just 2 weeks.
I was in the kitchen and I said, oh, you're coming in for your tea, Stephen? And he was looking quite agitated and quite angry, and he said, oh, I'd rather not. I'd like to take it up to my room if I can.
The next morning, Farrow fled, but not before dumping a bag into the bins outside.
We decided to go and look to see what it was he'd thrown away, and it was a shirt and trousers and some socks, and the Gideon Bible, what was in the room, what we'd left there, which we felt quite disappointed about that he'd thrown that one in the bin.
Farrow was getting more erratic and struggling to hide his aggressive feelings towards the church. Back in Bridport, he made a confession.
He turned up here, all quite flustered. Oh, Michaela, you're the only one that can help me. You're the only one that listens, sort of thing. And I'm like, well, you know, what have you done? And he said, oh, it was just a fracas with another homeless guy. And I said, what do you mean, a fracas? He said, oh, well, he was asking me for money, he said, and I didn't bloody have any. And so he said, I sort of hit him a few times. Then he also admitted to chucking some blood-stained clothes into a river. Then he handed me over this knife and said, look, can you take this, as I don't trust myself with this. I was like, wow. I really didn't feel safe then.
Stephen Farrow was spiralling out of control. Once again he hit the road, and as it approached Christmas, he arrived in the Gloucestershire town of Thornbury.
It's an old market town. There's lots of walking groups and lots of, you know, just activity groups, and it's all kind of all centred around the church. I mean, it's just one of the oldest buildings in the town. I don't write about that much crime, I have to say. We cover a lot of areas, and Thornbury is probably the quietest by a mile. So very, 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 very safe, very, very quiet.
With no home to go to, Farrow sneaked into this quiet community with criminal intent.
He broke into a house in Thornbury. The owners weren't there, they were gone for the holidays. He stayed there for a few days, kind of ransacked the house, sort of ate the food.
Farrow kept out of sight and in the warm. He helped himself to a passport and jewellery. When it was time to go, he couldn't resist leaving a terrifying message.
He sort of pinned a note to their kitchen table with a knife. And it was kind of written in a very weird handwriting, basically saying he hated Christians and saying that they were lucky they hadn't come back before he left. He basically threatened Christian scum.
Well, most intruders would want to leave as few signs as possible that they'd been there, but not Farrow. It's clearly very important for him that people take notice of him. So he leaves a sign, a statement, a very dramatic and intimidating statement. But it mentions Christian scum. And this is unusual because in actual fact, the couple who live there have no connection to the church. He targets the church, but really anybody who lives better than him and pays no mind to him is Christian scum.
Farrow kept moving and headed north. His next stop was Kidderminster and the local pawnbrokers.
I remember that I was on my own that day, which is very rare. I can remember he came in, his whole persona instantly put me on edge. He was very tall and quite broad, and he had quite an angry expression on his face, and I instantly closed the security gate. He made a comment about that, which again, because he'd noticed it, he put me on edge.
This time, Farrow wasn't here to cause trouble. He was on business.
The jewellery that he brought in, he was trying to tell me it belonged to his mother, but I could clearly see that there were too many different styles for it to have come from one person. So there were several people's jewellery there. He knew exactly what he was doing selling the gold. He knew exactly how to sell gold. He knew the prices of the gram. So this clearly wasn't the first time that he'd done it, although he was making out it was the first time.
Annabella had her suspicions and tried to put Farrow off with a low offer.
He knew that I'd gone out on quite a low gram weight, but he still accepted it. And I think that's probably because it saved him from going into the town centre where there were so many security cameras around. That's why I think he chose my company.
Annabella paid Farrow £80 and kept the jewellery to one side. The following day, New Year's Eve, Farrow composed a string of text messages, lifting the lid on his violent plans, and sent them to his old friend, Michaela.
It was basically, you never knew quite how disturbed I am. I'm surprised the police have never told you. I'll be in the newspapers on the news soon. I won't stop until I get caught. The church is having it first. You need to look behind you because you'll never know when I could be there. I was frightened for my own safety and for that of the church, because he'd made a threat to the church. Obviously, I didn't know where he was, what area he was in.
Michaela alerted police to Farrow's increasingly ominous texts threatening the church. But by January the 2nd, Farrow arrived in Worcestershire and a riverbank on the outskirts of Bewdley. Within hours, he'd committed a murder.
It was an ordinary day in the office until I got a call to go to Kidderminster Police Station.
Jennifer Meyerhans was the local reporter for the Kidderminster shuttle.
We were told there'd been a murder. It was a 77-year-old lady in an isolated cottage off Dales Road, and that's all we knew. It was a shock because nothing like this happens in Bewdley.
The victim was Betty Yates, a local woman who lived alone in an isolated cottage on the banks of the River Severn.
The following morning I came out to Dales Road and door knocked all the neighbours, speaking to people in the local community. Everyone was in a lot of shock. It became apparent she was very well known and well liked in the community. People were describing her as a pillar of the community. She was a retired teacher, so she touched a lot of lives. Lots of people knew her and had loved her.
Now, Betty had been found savagely murdered in her own home.
It wasn't until later on that the police made it clear she'd been beaten to death with a walking stick and sustained a fatal stab wound.
And Farrow had murdered Betty in an apparently motiveless attack. But he had arrived in the town unannounced and soon made his escape. The community was left bewildered.
For a few weeks, it was a total mystery. People were talking of a burglary gone wrong. An intruder had come into the home and she was trying to defend the home that she loved. People were just baffled as to who could do something to such a defenceless old lady.
So the media were called upon to help in the hunt for clues.
We appealed for lots of information, people seen any cars or any suspicious movements around this area, especially fishermen, walkers may have seen anything out of the ordinary.
But the investigation didn't identify Farrow, and the homeless drifter was now on the run. It appeared he had got away with murder.
Stephen Farrow has been harbouring thoughts of harming people for many, many years, and it seems that murder has become an inevitability for him. To his mind, this is his mission, something that's going to give him meaning in life. He's killed an old lady with no connection to the church whatsoever, and that's sufficient for now. There's a cooling off period, but he's got much greater plans, and it won't be long before he starts to put those plans into motion.
After 5 weeks of travelling the country, Farrow returned to Thornbury, the town where he had written his sinister note. This time, he had no plans to leave without killing again. His arrival was caught on CCTV.
First of all, getting off a bus on the high street in Thornbury, just a man with a backpack goes down the High Street, down the Plain and Castle Street.
At the bottom of Castle Street is another church, St Mary's. Farrow made his way to the vicarage, home to Reverend John Suddards. When the Reverend opened the door, he was violently attacked. Farrow stabbed him 7 times and watched him die in the hallway.
Well, after he killed the vicar, it seems he ransacked the house, then found lots of different objects and some homosexual pornography, and he found condoms and even party poppers, and he just placed them all around the body. But after that, he seemed to spend the night and watched a DVD and had some of the vicar's beers. He stayed a long while afterwards and just made himself comfortable.
It's clear that Stephen Farrow maybe didn't have a love-hate relationship with the church, but had a hate-need relationship with the church. He gravitated towards religious communities to have his needs met. He relied on them for shelter, for food, and to some extent, emotional support. And yet he targets a vicar, and it's very clear that his aim is to humiliate the vicar and send shockwaves throughout the very community who he relies on.
Who would want to be in a room with a dead body in the first place and just, you know, have a normal night in watching a film and drinking beers? That just seems completely insane. It really does seem just, why would you stay there?
The following morning, Stephen Farrow set off early. Again, CCTV cameras captured his route into town.
So after the murder, Stephen Farrow walked from the church, which is right down there, and then he walked up Castle Street. He was caught on CCTV round here, and then he walked all the way up Castle Street, past the Catholic church, and then he took a bus for Bristol and just left the town.
Within days, police had a prime suspect. Forensic officers had scoured the crime scene and discovered some DNA on a single bottle top from beers drunk after the attack. The DNA was tested and found to come from Stephen Farrow. So detectives launched a manhunt, determined to catch Farrow before he struck again. Meanwhile, the country held its breath.
We went to bed with hammers, bats, because we didn't know if he was going to turn up here and we'd have to fight for our lives.
In February 2012, a police manhunt was underway. Stephen Farrow was suspected of the brutal murder of Reverend John Suddards in his vicarage in Thornbury.
Officers say 47-year-old Stephen Farrow, who's known to travel all over Britain, is a danger to the public.
Crucially, he may also seek to exploit the charity of the church community.
Police say he should not be approached under any circumstances. Anyone who sees him should dial 999.
CID had turned up, asking me questions about Stephen Farrow, and I instantly said to them, he's done something bad, hasn't he? Well, they wouldn't elaborate on what he'd done, obviously couldn't disclose what he'd done, but my house was put on red alert, my phones were tapped. My children and I were that petrified. We all slept in the same bedroom together, locked each and every door. We went to bed with hammers, bats, because we didn't know if he was going to turn up here and we'd have to fight for our lives. We were absolutely terrified.
Unbeknown to Michaela, Farrow had travelled by bus to the opposite side of the country, to Folkestone in Kent. He set up camp in a remote wilderness known locally as the Badlands. But when he called into some friends on Blackpool Road, they recognised him as wanted and tipped off police. A dangerous psychopath was soon under arrest. Farrow's criminal career had finally been brought to an end.
So when we heard about the arrest, there was a great sense of relief. The police had done a good job. They arrested someone really quickly. But I guess the next question was, what's going to happen now? I mean, why did he do this? He was a drifter, he wasn't from the area, It just seemed completely random and people wanted answers.
But police in Bewdley were still investigating the unsolved murder of Betty Yates, and the arrest of a homeless drifter with a history of using knives soon put Farrow at the top of their list of suspects. No sooner was Farrow being questioned on one murder, he was being questioned on two.
The police forces had worked together to link him to Betty Yates' murder. That gave us ideas. I mean, Betty was a very a kind and welcoming lady. Who made us think, well, has she tried to help him? And it gave us a bit more to go on.
Farrow refused to answer police questions, but in meetings with a mental health nurse, he opened up about his crimes.
He told the nurse that he'd been smoking cannabis and just locked himself up and smoked for 4 days, and he knew then that he was going to kill the vicar. I mean, he planned it. In fact, he said he wanted to crucify him originally, but he'd forgotten his hammer and nails somewhere. He knew what he was doing, and in fact, he'd planned everything.
The meetings also yielded the only account of what happened on the night of the vicar's murder.
The vicar actually said, "I'm dying," after he was stabbed, and pleaded for his life and begged him not to kill him, and he just told him to hurry up and die, and just killed him. He didn't care.
Crucially, Farrow even revealed the motives behind his campaign of hatred against the church.
He said he'd been abused by members of the church as a child, and that's why he hated the church. He had a vendetta against the church, but paradoxically he was obsessed with God and quite religious.
It's not known if Farrow's claims are true or a convenient excuse, but experts doubt that they were his only motivation.
It may well be the case that Stephen Farrow was sexually abused by a member of the church in his childhood. Now, many people sadly are abused, and many people do not go on to abuse others, and they certainly don't go on to kill several people. There's more to the story than that. It seems to me that not only did Stephen Farrow have an intense hatred of clergy members, but an intense hatred of people in general.
Frighteningly, Farrow had revealed his plans even before he'd committed murder. He'd left a note in Thornbury threatening Christian scum, and he texted Michaela saying the church would get it first.
He had actually murdered the Reverend. Golly. He said he was going to do that, and he did. Don't really know what else to say. It was sickening.
In October 2012, Farrow stood trial at Bristol Crown Court. He denied murdering Betty Yates, but admitted the burglary in Thornbury and accepted he had killed Reverend Suddards, but claimed diminished responsibility. After a 4-week trial, Farrow was found guilty on all charges.
I felt sick to the pit of my stomach. How could a human being behave in that manner? I was mortified. I just feel so terribly, terribly sorry and sad for the families. I just cannot believe someone could behave like that and commit those crimes. It's awful.
The judge said he was a sadist and added him to the list of 48 prisoners told they will never be released.
He did say to the psychiatric nurse that he had plans and that he wanted to, kill people, and he could have killed many other people, and I think that's probably why. It's just to stop him, they had to do this, they had to lock him up for life.
Total elation. I felt safe. Who's to say he wouldn't have gone on and committed some more crimes? He needed to be caught, and I'm so glad he was.
For the communities touched by Farrow's crimes, the impact will live long in the memory.
Betty Yates' murder really shook the community. Everyone was really touched by it, really upset and distressed by it. I don't think it's something that will be forgotten very easily. Out here, they're going to remember what happened there.
But for the son of Farrow's first victim, attacked in 1994, questions remain about why he was free to kill.
I was appalled that 2 people had died due to his being released. I hope it lives with him for the rest of his miserable life.